So it is the second last day of the World Water Week, which is being held in Stockholm, that is in Sweden. The theme for this year's event is Water for a Peaceful and Sustainable Future. South Africa has been battling with water supply in several parts of the country due to ailing infrastructure. Water experts say that even though the national long-term water strategy seeks to diversify water resources, it's equally important to educate communities on sustainable water practices. Researcher from UCT, water expert Tebogo Mofokeng, joins us now on ways in which water can be recycled within our homes. Tebogo, a very good morning to you. Thank you so much for making time for us. What sparked the interest in the research first?
Morning, Aldrin, and thank you for having me bright and early. What sparked the research was really thinking about our relationship with water and looking at how when it's drought crisis, we do what we need to do, but once the rains come, then we rebound to our usual habits. And also just looking at the water strategy, if we use less water, and yes, if we fixed all the leaks in terms of our ailing infrastructure, it would be just enough to hold us. But the other tension is that our populations are forever increasing. So it's not only important to use it wisely, but it's also important to consider alternative water sources because of our ever increasing population.
Yeah, and now looking at your survey question and also the options that you've given your respondents there, seawater, I never thought of that as one of the options.
Fantastic. So the study that we did was specifically looking at communities where we discharge the toilet water into the sea. Those communities are in Cape Town, Rebecca, and Durban. And because they are so close to the sea, it made sense to consider offering them an alternative such as seawater for toilet flushing only. That alternative water source has been used in Hong Kong since the 1950s. They resorted to that strategy then to sort of improve their water security from China, and it still remains part of their long-term strategy in terms of all the new developments that they are now bringing online. They have a dual water supply system where there is dedicated water for seawater for flushing toilets. So it would only really be applicable to those communities because they are close to the sea, and if we were to continue with the practice of discharging untreated wastewater to the sea, that scenario would make sense. But what we also included in our survey was to understand if communities had a preference for changing the way we dispose of the wastewater. And what we offered in terms of questions was, would you prefer it if we treated the water before we discharge it? Or the other alternative was, can we treat it and then recycle it back into the homes?
Yeah. And in terms of the recycling back into the homes, how do we go about that? What tips can you share with our audience? And apologies if you are eating, if you're having your breakfast, but I need to make this example. Growing up, we've been taught that if it's yellow, let it mellow, and if it's brown, let it go down. But there are hygienic questions around this as well. But the emphasis around that is making sure that you do not waste water. So what tips then can you share with the audience today?
Absolutely, Aldrin. So our research was more focused on if it was up to the municipality to treat it and give it to you. Mm-hmm. Other researchers have looked into if you were to invest in a small treatment unit that could be housed within your house, and that would then make sure that it treats the water to good enough quality that it doesn't cause any sickness in the home. So there are lots of innovative solutions that are out there for households to consider to treat the wastewater part. So, and there's also alternative treatment processes to treat your bath water and your water from the sink, because those two waters are very different and have a very different potential for bacteria to cause harm. So yes, absolutely. So in those studies, what we haven't really, the question we haven't asked is the investment capital required if you were to do it in your own home. So what we were interested in our survey was if you didn't have to invest in the capital to treat it on site, meaning in your home, but rather the city did it at a city scale, where they would then provide you with a dedicated line that comes to your house, and all you need to do is just flush the toilet using that water.
Yeah. And did you ask that question in relation, for instance, when it comes to municipalities, if it was the municipality that was to bear the cost of the infrastructure that is required, for instance, looking at seawater and using seawater for toilets, what that amount would look like? Because I remember when we have conversations around desalination, we're always told that how expensive it is and how various municipalities and even government is not willing to spend so much money on desalination, but the infrastructure that is required to have seawater go into homes.
So what we considered in our study was, because if you're using seawater to flush toilet, we don't need it to be to a standard where it's for drinking purposes. So we actually don't need to get the salt out of the water, and that's what makes it expensive. So what Hong Kong does, it screens it. That means you just remove any algae, any floating objects that would have been in the water, and you add chlorine. And what the chlorine does, it kills any harmful bacteria. So the water would still be very salty. So the reason why seawater for flushing toilets in that context is attractive is that it doesn't incur a lot of treatment costs. But yes, there would be a dual cost. And what the pricing that we proposed to the households was rather the cost of the water arriving at your house, and that we based on the Hong Kong cost. And how we positioned the question was it would either add this much to your water bill or it would decrease your water bill by this much. Because in the alternative water sources we offered included seawater and recycled water. And currently the city, especially the city of Cape Town, offers recycled water at a discount. So what we're trying to test was if it increased your utility bill or if it decreased your utility bill, how likely would you be to accept the water? And what we found was that an overwhelming majority of the households were interested in using an alternative source, and more so recycled water than seawater. And what we found from our models was that there's a lot of uncertainty about seawater, and I guess a lot of our community doesn't know about it. And when we did focus groups, we realized that there was a concern about corrosion of plumbing and that sort of thing. So in piloting new ideas, a lot of what needs to follow after that is how do we educate our community to either accept it or to explain to them what the consequences would be in using that kind of water.
Yeah. And that wastewater, with that sea water, which then becomes wastewater, would that still go back into the sea?
So the options we gave was that yes, it goes back to the sea, or yes, we can treat it. So there is a treatment technology that uses what we call that uses bacteria that can thrive in salty conditions, and that's been used successfully in Hong Kong to treat the wastewater. And what's fantastic about that technology is that it doesn't require a lot of energy compared to our normal wastewater technology systems, and also it produces very little what we call sludge, which is sort of solid material, which is a byproduct of the wastewater treatment process. While we didn't necessarily test their preferences for what the treatment process would look like, but what would be interesting is that depending on the type of waters that we use, there are different back-end treatment technologies that can be considered that have a lot more benefits from a footprint perspective, from an energy consumption perspective, and also from a generation of waste that needs to be disposed to, for example, very specialized landfill sites that can receive that kind of waste.
Yeah. And interesting also is looking at how the people are responding based also on their household income. 12 people for households that earned around 12,800 a month, they preferred using drinking water, prefer flushing with drinking water rather.
We found that quite interesting. A lot of the research, which hasn't really been done in our African context, which has been done in most developing countries, our understanding from research was it was more the high-income households that would prefer that are less likely to consider alternative water sources, whether for drinking or flushing toilets. So this is very interesting information for us. That for us, it's really from middle income to high income, where people would still choose to flush with drinking water. We've built other models to sort of help us understand what portion of the sample would behave like that, and sort of, are they the highly educated? Are they people with bigger households? And what we're seeing is that for the sample that we have in Hout Bay, it's about 5%. So the sample was about 350 households. So that's about 5%. And what that will then help us to understand is how do we re-educate people to understand that it's not that the rains come, it's that yes, the rains come, but because of growing populations, there won't be enough going forward. So if we want to build a sustainable future for future generations, this generation has to have a different relationship with alternative water sources. So it sort of becomes a norm and more sustainable for future generations.
Let me just quickly throw in this one, Tebogo, and maybe it's not a question that you've dealt with, but for the future and looking at the built environment, is there conversation to be had around new infrastructure, new buildings that are being built, to say that let's rather have a smaller toilet tank compared to the size of the toilet tanks that we're currently using?
Absolutely, Aldrin. There's toilet systems that can use up to 2 liters to flush, and in some of the older buildings we're using 13 liters. There's now systems where if it's yellow, it's a smaller volume, and if it's brown, it's a bigger volume. And I think a lot of the new housing developments in South Africa are already including those kinds of toilets, and there's a whole revolution also around toilets. There's toilets that are waterless, and you can actually compost, and it can produce compost in your home. But if we think of the fact that we're building more high density buildings, we will probably have to think of a slightly different toilet. And even in those systems, we sort of are thinking about, do we need these big wastewater treatment facilities with these long pipelines that take the sewage away from the homes and take them to somewhere that's at the outskirts, which is no longer at the outskirts at the rate of urbanization? We're looking more at, if we build a high density development, could we contain the wastewater there and recycle it there? Could we build retention ponds and use that water to maybe water lawns? So there's a moving view to look at high density buildings as a unit and try see how we can maximize and reuse water within those higher density communities.
Yeah, and also looking at the innovation around septic tanks, especially
Absolutely.
in rural areas. Thank you so much for your time.